The official designation on my transfer papers was Diplomatic Archivist, second grade, attached personnel Vethani Conclave Liaison Office, provisional seat, non-voting. I read that 3 times before I signed it. Non-voting. I had been in the Foreign Service for 19 years. I had documented 17 bilateral trade revisions, 4 species contact protocols, 2 full planetary annexation hearings, and 1 incident involving a Gret Halley ambassador and a misidentified earth pastry that nearly became a diplomatic incident of the first order. I held a master's degree in interstellar records law and a secondary certification in xenolinguistic transcription. I had never, in 19 years, been described as non-voting. My supervisor at the bureau, a man named Peltz who wore the same gray cardigan every day and had the interpersonal warmth of a decommissioned filing cabinet, explained it to me over coffee that had gone cold before he'd finished pouring it. The Vethani requested a human presence at the conclave, he said. Formal courtesy, symbolic. They want to demonstrate openness to the broader coalition by including humanity in the chamber. As what? I said. As present, Peltz said. I looked at him. They were quite specific, he said, that they didn't want a negotiator. They didn't want a representative with authority to bind agreements. They want a human in the room, for appearances. They've allotted a desk in the back of the chamber, near the recording equipment. Near the recording equipment, I said. You'll have full access to the session transcripts as they're produced. The Vethani use their own archival system. You just be maintaining the human side record. Cross-reference, cataloging, that sort of thing. I looked at my coffee. It was the color of old motor oil. They think this is a courtesy posting, I said. Peltz had the good grace not to smile. The term they used in the official communication was observational compliment, their phrase, not ours. I said nothing for a moment, then I signed the transfer papers. Peltz slid them back across the desk. It's 6 months, he said. The conclave runs 11 sessions. You keep the record, you file your reports, you come home. And no one at the Vethani table is going to take me seriously, I said. Peltz picked up his cold coffee and took a long, considered sip. I wouldn't imagine so, he said. I packed 2 bags and a portable archival terminal and flew to the Vethani conclave station above Kethavori on a Tuesday. The preparation took longer than the packing. 3 weeks, approximately, working evenings after my regular bureau caseload. I pulled the complete history of the Kethavori shipping corridor from the Foreign Service Archive. Every bilateral instrument, every amendment, every protocol revision going back 11 years. I pulled the joint infrastructure agreements for the relay stations. I pulled the precedent file for corridor access disputes in the broader coalition, which was a separate 30-year record. I organized it all into a working archive, indexed 3 ways, chronologically, by document reference number, and by the article and clause numbers most likely to come up in a framework negotiation. This is not unusual preparation for an archival posting. It is what archival postings require. The unusual thing, if there was one, was that I had been told explicitly that this was not an archival posting in any meaningful sense. It was a courtesy gesture, a symbolic presence, a warm body in the back of the room. Peltz had said as much. The Vethani had said as much in their official communication, which I had also filed and cross-referenced. I prepared anyway. This is also not unusual. In 19 years, I have learned that the difference between a posting that goes well and a posting that goes badly is almost always in the file preparation. You cannot predict exactly what you will need. You prepare for everything plausible and let the work tell you what matters. I have never, in those 19 years, finished an assignment and thought, I wish I had brought fewer documents. The regret, when it comes, always runs the other direction. I flew to the Vethani conclave station above Kethavori on a Tuesday. It took 4 days, 2 transit hops, and 1 shuttle connection that was late by 45 minutes, which I spent in the transit lounge reviewing my file index. The station was beautiful, I'll give them that. The Vethani build like birds, everything tapered and vaulted and reaching upward, their architecture convinced at every turn that the ceiling ought to be higher than it is. The diplomatic chamber had a ceiling 40 meters up, all pale gold alloy struts fanning out like wing bones, and the main negotiating table was an immense oval of dark polished stone that must have weighed as much as a loaded freighter. Around it sat 12 Vethani senior delegates, their feathered crests fanned in formal display, blue-black primary plumage, white throat markings, the long decorative tail quills that indicated senior diplomatic rank rustling softly as they settled into their chairs. My desk was in the back corner, beside a rack of Vethani recording equipment that stood about 2 meters tall and hummed with a low, resonant frequency that I would later determine was, for the Vethani, the equivalent of elevator music. Soothing, background, meant to fill the silence. There was a small placard on my desk. It said, in Vethani script and standard, Terran observational compliment. The delegate to my immediate left, a junior attaché named Soveth who was responsible for the Vethani's own session minutes, glanced at my placard when I sat down, then at me, then back at his own considerably larger workstation. He said something in Vethani that my translator rendered as, "They sent someone for the desk." I set up my terminal. I arranged my reference files. I opened a new transcription document and labeled it Session 1 VTHANI Conclave, KTHAVORI Station, and typed the date, the chamber, the attending delegates, and the session agenda. Then I waited for the session to begin. The session chair was a Vethani named Keth Salvar. I would learn later that she was one of the most senior diplomats in the Conclave service, 30 years in the field, credited with 3 successful annexation protocols, and a species contact framework that had held for a decade without amendment. Her crest was the darkest blue I had seen on any of them, almost black, and her tail quills were long enough that a junior aide had to carry them clear of the floor when she walked. She opened the session with a formal acknowledgement of all present parties. She named the 12 Vethani delegates. She named the 2 Gret Holly observers seated in the side gallery. She named the consortium trade representative. Then she paused, looked at my corner of the room, and said, in standard, with the particular careful enunciation of someone speaking a language they find mildly inconvenient, "And we note the presence of the Terran observational complement." She said it the way you'd note the presence of a potted plant. Accurate, necessary for the record, moving on. I noted it in my own record. I noted the exact phrasing she used. I noted the pause before she said it and the fact that she did not look at me while she said it. I noted the time, 09:14:32 Station Standard. I noted the names and stated roles of all present parties in their seating order, the ambient temperature of the chamber as registered by my terminal's environmental sensor, and the exact title displayed on the agenda screen at the front of the room. The agenda title was KTHAVORI Corridor Access Framework, Preliminary Session, Review and Modernization. The word modernization was doing a lot of work in that title. I noted that too. Then the session began, and I listened and I typed. I should explain what typing looks like for an archivist in that kind of setting, because it is not what most people picture. It is not a stenographer's function, capturing words as they fall, keeping pace with speech, producing a raw transcript. A diplomatic archivist produces a layered record. The words are the surface. Under the words is the citation layer. Every claim that invokes a prior instrument gets a footnote, pulled from the file, the reference number and date and relevant clause noted in the margin of the working document. Under the citation layer is the discrepancy layer. Any point at which what is being said diverges from what the instruments on file say, flagged for analysis. And under the discrepancy layer is the context layer, which is the most important one and the one no official translation system captures. Who is speaking, in what register, in response to what, with what effect on the room? That is 4 simultaneous streams of attention. After 19 years, it runs on its own, the way driving runs on its own after a sufficient number of miles. The conscious mind is free for other things, while the hands and the trained subconscious handle the mechanics. What the conscious mind was free for, across those first sessions, was watching the room. The first 3 sessions were procedural: opening positions, trade framework parameters, preliminary agreements on terminology. The Vethani moved through them efficiently. They were good at this, genuinely good. Their diplomatic corps trained for it. From what I gathered was something close to adolescence. They spoke in layered registers, the formal record-level language for statements intended to bind, a slightly softer register for exploratory proposals, and a rapid, lower-frequency chatter between delegates that was clearly off-the-record commentary. The Vethani translator assigned to the chamber rendered the formal record-level speech into standard in real time. The off-the-record chatter, as far as the official translation system was concerned, did not exist. My translator was not the official translation system. I had brought my own, a field unit, older model, secondary market acquisition, the kind of thing you pick up when you've spent enough years in xenolinguistic transcription to know that official translation systems are calibrated for what the other side wants you to hear. Mine was calibrated for everything in the room. I did not make a point of this. I sat at my desk near the recording equipment that hummed like elevator music, and I typed, and I listened. In session 1, the off-the-record commentary included the following: a delegate named Vethkoreth noting that humanity's filing clerk had very small hands for a species that claimed to be manual tool users. General agreement that human diplomatic presence was a formality the coalition required, and the Vethani were sensible enough to provide at minimal cost. Soveth, the junior attaché, observing that the Terran had set up a personal terminal and appeared to be taking notes, which was either diligence or an inability to understand that note-taking was not required of a symbolic presence. More general agreement. I typed all of it. In session 2, the off-the-record commentary ran a little longer. Kethsolvar herself, during a recess, remarked to her deputy that humans were an industrious species, but that their insistence on written records was a cultural artifact of limited memory. They write things down because they cannot hold them in their heads. Her deputy agreed. Someone else noted that the Terran had brought a very large case of archival materials for what was, after all, a non-voting observational post. And wasn't that the most human thing imaginable, to over-prepare for a role that required nothing? I found that one almost funny. I typed it anyway. Session 3 introduced the first substantive negotiation, trade access to the Kethavori shipping corridor, which was the whole reason the conclave existed. Humanity had claims in that corridor going back 8 years, established under a framework agreement that predated the Vethani's current delegation by 2 full diplomatic cycles. The framework agreement was a matter of public record. It was also, I noted with the quiet professional attention of someone who has spent 19 years cataloging exactly this kind of thing, not on the table in front of the Vethani delegates. Their working documents referenced a different framework, an earlier one that predated the human claims by approximately 4 years and had been superseded, formally, in writing, with all the correct notarizations and countersignatures, by the agreement I had in my files. I noted the discrepancy. I noted the document reference numbers on both versions. I noted the date the superseding agreement had been filed, the name of the Vethani archivist who had countersigned it, and the fact that Kethsolvar's working document appeared to be working from a version of the record that predated the supersession. I did not raise this in the session. I was, after all, non-voting. I typed my notes, I cross-referenced the documents, I moved on. After session 3, Sovath stopped by my desk as the chamber was clearing. He looked at my terminal screen, not long enough to read anything, just long enough to register that there was a great deal of text on it, and then looked at me. "Do you enjoy this?" he said in careful standard. "The archival work," I said. "Sitting in the back," he said, "recording things that do not require recording." I considered this. "I find it useful," I said. He looked at me for a moment the way you look at something you've misidentified and are trying to recategorize. Then he made a small sound, Vethani, which my translator rendered as something between him and well then, and went back to his own workstation. Session 4 was where it started getting interesting. The corridor access proposal on the table was structured as a new framework, not an amendment to the existing agreement but a replacement of it. The Vethani lead negotiator, a delegate named Veth Maris who had the precise, slightly glassy manner of someone who had been trained to be charming and had never had to try very hard at it, presented the proposal as a modernization. The existing framework, he explained, was outdated. The Vethani conclave had developed a more efficient access protocol in the intervening years. It would be in everyone's interest to adopt the new structure. I noted, Session 4, Veth Maris' explicit proposal to replace existing framework agreement. Cross-reference. Existing framework reference 7741 HT, signed 22170614, current and not expired. Veth Maris' proposed replacement, unnumbered draft undated. The Gret Holly observers did not object. The consortium representative nodded along. Nobody looked at the desk in the corner. Veth Maris continued. The new framework would establish corridor access on a usage-weighted basis. Vessels using the corridor more frequently would have proportionally greater scheduling priority. It was, he said, simply rational. I noted, usage-weighted priority proposal. Cross-reference. Existing Framework Agreement Article 7, Clause 3, which establishes equal scheduling access for all signatories regardless of usage frequency. The proposed replacement would effectively eliminate Article 7, Clause 3, and the signatory most affected would be the party with the least current usage. I looked up the current corridor usage figures in my files. The party with the least current usage was Humanity. We had lower usage because we were in an infrastructure expansion phase, which the existing framework agreement had specifically anticipated and accommodated. Article 7, Clause 4, also in my files. I typed all of this, I cross-referenced all of it, I labeled it clearly. Then I sat back and listened to the rest of Session 4, which included, in the off-the-record chatter, Keth Salvar saying to her deputy that the new framework would pass without difficulty, because the only party with a strong interest in preserving the old one had sent a record keeper who could not speak to the matter of record. I found this one genuinely funny. I did not show it, I kept typing. In the formal record, Session 4 ended with a procedural note that the framework replacement proposal had been accepted for consideration by all parties present. In my record, it ended with 19 pages of cross-reference discrepancy analysis and a complete verbatim transcript of everything said in the chamber, on the record and off. I filed my routine report to Peltz that evening. Summary: Session 4, Framework Replacement Proposal introduced by Vethani lead negotiator, under consideration. No notable developments. The phrase "no notable developments" was the most accurate thing I had written in 4 sessions. From my desk in the back corner, nothing appeared notable at all. That was rather the point. Session 5 moved into specifics. The corridor ran 11 light minutes end to end, with 6 major waypoints, 3 relay stations, and a dozen secondary monitoring posts distributed along its length. The Vethani proposal divided it into administrative segments, each with its own access protocol, fee structure, and priority scheduling mechanism. It was, from a purely technical standpoint, a well-constructed proposal. Considerable thought had gone into it. The segmentation was logical. The protocols were internally consistent. The fee structures were calibrated with a precision that spoke to a thorough understanding of transit economics. It also, in the cumulative effect of all those well-constructed segments, reduced human corridor access to something functionally closer to a conditional license than a guaranteed right. I noted each segment. I noted the fee structure for each. I noted the proposed priority mechanisms. I noted, in the cross-reference column, the specific provisions of the existing framework agreement that each new mechanism conflicted with, modified, or quietly erased. There were 14 such provisions. I cataloged all 14. The fee increase itself was in a technical annex. Specifically, Technical Annex 7 of the Session 5 Supplementary Materials, which was titled Corridor Infrastructure Maintenance Cost Allocation Review, and which ran to 42 pages of engineering specifications and cost model projections. On page 31, buried in a table labeled Revised Signatory Cost Share Projections, 5-year horizon, the human access fee was listed at a figure that, when I calculated it against the existing fee schedule and the projected transit volumes in my files, represented an increase of approximately 40% over 5 years. I noted the page number. I noted the table title. I noted the exact figures. I noted that the discussion in the session chamber had focused entirely on the engineering specifications, and that no delegate at the table had commented on the table on page 31. The consortium representative had, during the presentation of the technical annexes, been looking at his secondary screen with the expression of a man reviewing something unrelated to the current session. The off-the-record commentary in Session 5 was briefer. The Vethani delegates were in the detailed work of the proposal, and there was less casual chatter. But there was one exchange, late in the session, when Veth Korath leaned over to Veth Maris and said, in the lower frequency register, "The Terran is still writing." Veth Maris replied, "She writes everything, it is their custom, it means nothing." I wrote that down too. By Session 6, I had a document that was 87 pages long and growing. It was organized by session number, then by agenda item, then by the nature of the record discrepancy I had identified. And by this point there were 11 discrete discrepancies, ranging from the minor, a precedent citation that referenced the wrong case year, to the significant, a proposed amendment to the corridor access fee schedule that would have increased human transit costs by approximately 40% over 5 years. Slipped into Session 5 as a technical annex to an unrelated infrastructure proposal. I also had, by Session 6, a complete verbatim transcript of every piece of off-the-record commentary the Vethani delegation had produced in the chamber. This was partly professional habit. I transcribe everything. It's what archivists do, and partly because the commentary had itself become part of the record, not the diplomatic record, mine. The 40% fee increase had been introduced while Veth Korath was, simultaneously, observing in the off-record channel that the Terran appeared to be transcribing the session with great thoroughness for someone whose only role was to make the room look inclusive. His exact phrase, rendered by my translator, "She writes as though the words will matter." He had found this amusing. I had noted his exact phrasing, the exact time, the exact agenda item being discussed at the moment he said it, and the page number of the technical annex where the fee increase was buried. Words matter considerably in my experience. That's why people write them down. Session 6 also introduced me to the phenomenon I came to think of as the performance of the room. The Vethani delegates were skilled performers, in the sense that any experienced diplomat is a skilled performer. They understood that a chamber is a stage, and that what happens on the stage is one layer of a conversation with many layers beneath it. They performed competence, reasonableness, procedural correctness. They performed the inclusive gathering, the broad coalition, the new framework offered in the spirit of modernization and mutual benefit. They did not perform for the desk in the corner. That was the interesting part. They had assessed me in Session 1, confirmed their assessment through Sessions 2 and 3, and by Session 4 had ceased to calibrate their performance to include me at all. I was background. I was the elevator music of the diplomatic chamber, present and generating a sound they had decided was not signal. This was, from my perspective, an extremely comfortable position to work from. There is a quality of freedom in being genuinely disregarded. When you are considered an adversary or even a potential adversary, people modulate. They weigh what they say in your presence. They present one face to the room and keep another for private conference. When you are considered furniture, the calibration disappears. The private conference happens in front of you. The real assessments get made out loud, in the lower register, in what the speakers believe is a language you can't understand, about a process they believe you're not really following. I had access to 11 sessions of unmodulated Vethani diplomatic candor. I was grateful for it. It was, professionally speaking, the most valuable raw material I had encountered in 19 years. I kept my files in a specific order. Source documents at the back, the original framework agreements, the joint infrastructure instruments, the precedent citations, all of it organized chronologically and cross-referenced by article number and clause. Working analysis in the middle, discrepancy logs, flagged sections, my running comparison of proposed language against existing instruments. Transcripts at the front, session by session. On-record and off-record channels separated by a divider tab I had brought from home, each transcript complete and timestamped to the second. I had good reference materials because I had done my preparation before I left Earth. This is, in my experience, the actual work of archival postings, not the sitting in the room, which is the easy part, but the months of file preparation before you ever arrive. You pull every instrument that could conceivably be relevant to what the sessions will cover. You organize it so that any citation can be found in under 30 seconds. You know your documents the way a surgeon knows an instrument tray, not by reading, but by understanding the shape of the whole and exactly where each piece sits within it. Peltz had told me the sessions would cover corridor access and framework revision. I had pulled every relevant instrument from the human-side diplomatic archive going back 11 years. The oldest document in my files was dated 2/20/5/11/02. The most recent was dated 2/21/8/08/19, which was the most recent quarterly review of the Joint Infrastructure Agreement's maintenance protocols. I had brought those files because that is what preparation means. It does not mean bringing documents you know you will need. It means bringing documents you cannot rule out needing. There is a difference, and it is a difference that 19 years of this work teaches you quite thoroughly. By Session 6, I had a document that was 87 pages long and growing. It was organized by session number, then by agenda item, then by the nature of the record discrepancy I had identified. And by this point there were 11 discrete discrepancies, ranging from the minor, a precedent citation that referenced the wrong case year, to the significant, a proposed amendment to the corridor access fee schedule that would have increased human transit costs by approximately 40% over 5 years. Slipped into Session 5 as a technical annex to an unrelated infrastructure proposal. I also had, by Session 6, a complete verbatim transcript of every piece of off-the-record commentary the Vethani delegation had produced in the chamber. This was partly professional habit. I transcribe everything. It's what archivists do, and partly because the commentary had itself become part of the record, not the diplomatic record, mine. The 40% fee increase had been introduced while Veth Korath was, simultaneously, observing in the off-record channel that the Terran appeared to be transcribing the session with great thoroughness for someone whose only role was to make the room look inclusive. His exact phrase, rendered by my translator, "She writes as though the words will matter." He had found this amusing. I had noted his exact phrasing, the exact time, the exact agenda item being discussed at the moment he said it, and the page number of the technical annex where the fee increase was buried. Words matter considerably in my experience. That's why people write them down. Sessions 7 and 8 moved into the substantive drafting phase, the point at which the agreed parameters got translated into actual treaty language. This is where real diplomatic skill lies, in my opinion. The framework discussions are negotiating positions. The drafting is where the agreement gets made. Language that seems neutral can carry enormous weight in the wrong direction, and the weight is often invisible until it's too late to dispute. The Vethani drafters were good. I want to be clear about that. They were genuinely skilled, and the treaty language they were producing was technically correct and procedurally clean. Anyone reading it, without the broader context, would have found very little to object to. The broader context was in my document. In Session 7, the drafters introduced what they called the continuity provision language that would bridge the new framework to prior instruments. Continuity provisions are standard. They acknowledge that agreements exist in a sequence, that prior instruments have created conditions the new instrument builds on. Without a continuity provision, every new agreement is an island, unconnected to what came before. The Vethani continuity provision cited 4 prior instruments. My files contained 7 instruments that were directly relevant to the corridor access framework. The 4 they cited were the older ones, the ones that had been superseded, amended, or modified by the 3 they did not cite. The 3 they did not cite happened to be the ones that most clearly established human corridor rights. This was either an oversight or it wasn't. I noted both possibilities in my document. I noted the instruments cited and the instruments not cited. I noted the legal implication of each set. I labeled the section clearly: Continuity Provision Analysis, Instruments Cited versus Instruments Relevant. I made it 12 pages long. I sourced every claim. Across the aisle, so to speak, across the chamber, from my desk to the front table, the Vethani drafting team moved with the quiet confidence of people who believe the work is going well. They conferred in low voices. They made small amendments. They showed each other sections of the draft with the particular manner of craftspeople pleased with a piece of work coming together. Occasionally, Kethsolvar would lean over to review a passage, nod once, and sit back. Her tailquills had a certain relaxed quality to them in Sessions 7 and 8 that they had not had in Sessions 4 and 5, the settled quality of near completion. I noted this. I noted the draft language as it appeared on the shared display. I noted which sections of the draft were presented for discussion and which were passed through without comment. The sections passed through without comment were, with some regularity, the sections containing the most consequential language. In Session 8, the language was tightening up, the drafters moving from first pass to second, resolving ambiguities, standardizing definitions. There was a particular quality to this stage that I had always found satisfying, even as an observer. It is the stage at which the shape of the final agreement becomes visible. You can see what the parties have built when the scaffolding starts to come down. What they had built, in the draft I was reading in real time as it appeared on the chamber's shared drafting display, was a document that would systematically convert human corridor rights from guaranteed access to conditional privileges, doing so through the combined effect of the framework replacement, the usage-weighted mechanism, the fee schedule, the continuity provision, and the sovereignty clause that I knew was coming in Session 9 because it was on the agenda. Any one of those elements, taken alone, was arguably defensible. Together they formed a coherent structure with a clear outcome. I had documented that structure, element by element, across 8 sessions. By Session 8, my document was 130 pages long. There is something to be said for patience as a professional instrument. Not passive patience, the patience of someone waiting for something to happen, but the active kind, the patience of someone who understands that a record is only complete when the thing being recorded is complete. You do not raise your hand at Session 3. You do not table a partial document. You wait until the shape of the whole thing is visible and the document reflects it fully, and then you table it, and the document speaks for itself. My document was not yet complete at session 8. It would be complete at session 10. I kept filing my routine reports to the Bureau, Peltz, copy to the Foreign Service Archive, summary of sessions, nothing unusual to report. This was accurate from a certain perspective. Nothing was unusual. Things were proceeding exactly as they had been designed to proceed. I was observing them proceeding. I was writing down what I observed. Peltz replied once early on to say that the Bureau appreciated the thoroughness of my reports. I did not think he had read them. I did not mind. My reports were not, at that stage, addressed to Peltz. Session 9 introduced what Veth Maris called the Sovereignty Clause. I want to be precise about what the Sovereignty Clause was because precision matters here. On its face, it was a routine territorial acknowledgement, standard diplomatic language establishing which party had administrative jurisdiction over which segments of the Kethavori corridor. Standard, routine, necessary in any corridor access treaty. What it actually did, in the specific language Veth Maris proposed, was reclassify 3 relay stations in the corridor's outer segment. The existing framework agreement identified those relay stations as jointly administered, built under a multi-party infrastructure agreement, maintained by a coalition crew, accessible without restriction to all signatories. The Sovereignty Clause Veth Maris proposed reclassified them as Vethani Administrative Territory, subject to Vethani access protocols. The relay stations were, among other things, the refueling and resupply points that made the corridor economically viable for long transit vessels. Without them, the corridor was technically accessible but practically unusable for anything heavier than a light courier. I looked at the relay station specifications in my files. I looked at the joint infrastructure agreement under which they had been built. I looked at the names of the signatories. I noted the session number, the time, the exact proposed language, and the cross-reference to the Joint Infrastructure Agreement, which was Document 4412-Ka, signed 22090-307, still current, and explicitly not superseded by any subsequent instrument. There was a particular quality to this note that was different from the others. Not in the substance, it was formatted exactly like every other note, same citation style, same cross-reference structure, same precise language. But I had been building toward this note for 8 sessions, and when I wrote it, I had the sense of a long edition reaching its final column. A complete record is a specific thing. It is not a collection of facts. Facts are raw material. A record is what happens when you organize the facts into a structure that reveals their relationship to one another. When the discrepancy in Session 3 connects to the omission in Session 7, connects to the Sovereignty Clause in Session 9, and the whole shape becomes visible. That shape is what I had been building, session by session, from the desk in the corner near the elevator music recording equipment, while the room proceeded around me with the comfortable inattention of people who have correctly identified something as background. Keth Salvar, in the off-record channel during the recess that followed Veth Maris's presentation of the Sovereignty Clause, said to her deputy, "If it passes in this language, the corridor is ours. They have a filing clerk in the room. She'll write it down very neatly." I wrote it down very neatly. The off-record channel during Session 9's recesses was, in general, more relaxed than it had been in earlier sessions. The Vethani delegates had the careful ease of people who believe a long piece of work is approaching its conclusion and approaching it well. There was some discussion of what the signed treaty would mean for Vethani commercial interests in the outer corridor, some discussion of the timeline for implementing the new access protocols. Veth Korath, who had developed a minor running commentary on my note-taking habits over the course of the conclave, observed that the Terran archivist would have a very complete record of a treaty that humanity had been unable to prevent. He said this not unkindly. He said it the way you might observe that someone had kept excellent attendance at a meeting where the outcome was already decided, as a kind of tribute to professional diligence, in its way. I noted the time and the exact phrasing. I moved on. Session 10 was the penultimate session. Final language review, last opportunity for objections before formal signature in Session 11. The Gret Holly observers were quiet. The consortium representative had, at some point, stopped paying close attention. I noticed this because his note-taking had become less frequent, and his posture had adopted the particular relaxation of someone who believes the outcome is settled. Keth Salvar opened Session 10 in the formal record-level register. She acknowledged the presence of all parties. She got to my corner of the room and said, with the same precise, careful standard she had used in Session 1, "We note the presence of the Terran observational complement." I noted it, same as before. Time, 09-1451 Station Standard. I noted that the phrasing was identical to Session 1. I noted the time difference, 19 seconds later in the morning. I noted this because I noted everything. That's what archivists do. Keth Salvar moved through the agenda. Framework replacement confirmed. Usage-weighted priority confirmed. Fee schedule confirmed. Sovereignty clause. She paused here, almost imperceptibly in the way a very experienced diplomat pauses when they are not pausing but are checking something in their peripheral attention. Sovereignty clause confirmed. She asked, as was procedurally required, whether any party present had objections or amendments to raise before the treaty advanced to signature. The Gret Holly observers had no objections. The consortium representative had no objections. I had a document. I raised my hand. The chamber went quiet in a specific way. Not the silence of something expected happening, but the silence of something that did not fit the category of expected things. Keth Salvar looked at my corner of the room. Her crest, which had been fanned in the formal display posture, shifted slightly. Not much, just enough. "The Terran observational complement," she said, in standard with the careful pronunciation, "does not have speaking rights." "I don't need speaking rights," I said. "I have a document. I'd like to table it. That's a procedural action, not a speaking action. Article 14 of the Conclave Procedural Code permits any party present to table materials for the record at any point before signature." There was a silence. Keth Salvar looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Soveth, who was sitting at his workstation looking at me with the expression of someone in the process of very rapidly recategorizing something. "The Terran is not a party," Keth Salvar said. "I'm not a voting party," I said. "Article 14 doesn't require voting status. It requires presence. I've been present for all 11 sessions." Another silence, longer. "What document?" Keth Salvar said. "It's a record," I said. "An archival record of the sessions, all of them. I've been keeping it since Session 1. I paused. "It's fairly comprehensive." I transferred the document to the chamber's shared terminal. It was 193 pages. The table of contents alone was 4 pages. The chamber's shared terminal displayed the table of contents on the main screen, which was a large screen, mounted at the front of the room where everyone could see it. The table of contents included the section headings. The section headings included Discrepancy Log Framework Document Supersession, Discrepancy Log Article 7 Preservation Obligations, Discrepancy Log Joint Infrastructure Agreement 4412Ka, and Contemporaneous Commentary, Vethani Delegation, Off-Record Channel, Sessions 1 through 10, verbatim. Keth Salvar looked at the screen. Her crest had gone very still. "The observational complement," she said slowly, "has been recording the off-record channel." "I've been recording the room," I said. "That's what archivists do." Veth Korath, who was seated about 4 meters to my left, looked at me and then at the screen and then at the table of contents line that read Contemporaneous Commentary, Vethani delegation, off-record channel, sessions 1 through 10, verbatim. His crest flattened completely. His exact words, 7 sessions ago, were now in 41 pages of appendix. The document included, I should mention, all of them, every delegate at the table, every aide who had spoken within range of my translator, every remark about the filing clerk's small hands, every observation about a species that writes things down because it cannot hold them in its head, every casual prediction that the Corridor Access Treaty would pass because the only party with a strong interest in the original framework had sent someone who could not speak to the matter of record. All of it cross-referenced, time-stamped, formatted in the conclave's own procedural citation style, which I had looked up on the first day and adopted for consistency. Kethsalvar was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, she used the formal record-level register. Council will review the tabled document. This session is in recess pending review. Of course, I said. I have copies if anyone needs them, physical and digital. I had brought physical copies, 7 of them, 1 for each of the chamber's primary parties and 2 for the record. They were in a folder on my desk, printed on the Bureau's standard archival paper, each one bound with the Foreign Service stamp and my credentials on the cover page, Marin Salis, diplomatic archivist, 2nd grade, attached personnel, Vethani Conclave Liaison Office. I set the folder on the edge of my desk and waited. The recess lasted 4 hours and 23 minutes. I ate a meal I had brought from the station cafeteria, drank 2 cups of coffee that were hot when I drank them, and read through my document once more to make sure I hadn't missed anything. I hadn't. 19 years is a long time to develop habits, and one of the habits I had developed was that I didn't table documents until they were complete. Soveth came over to my desk about an hour into the recess. He stood there for a moment, looking at the folder on the edge of the desk, and then at me. "How long did it take you?" he said. "What, the document?" I said. "I started it in session 1. I've been adding to it every session, about 4 hours per session on average for the cross-referencing. The off-record transcription was real-time. I have a good field unit." Soveth looked at the folder again. "She doesn't know," he said. I assumed he meant Kethsalvar. "Know what?" I said. "That you had the whole thing," he said. "She thought we all thought." "That I was keeping the human side record," I said. "I was. This is the human side record." He looked at me. His crest was doing something I hadn't seen it do before, a sort of compressed, inward motion, like a fan being very carefully closed. "The filing clerk," he said quietly. "The archivist," I said. "2nd grade attached personnel." He stood there for another moment. Then he went back to his workstation. The review panel, 3 Vethani legal counsel who had been brought in from the station's diplomatic support staff, went through the document section by section. I could see them at the front of the chamber, working through the pages with the focused, slightly unhappy attention of people reading something they had not expected to have to read. Kethsalvar joined them after the first hour. I watched her read. She was very controlled about it. Vethani senior diplomats are very controlled. It is the product of a lifetime of training, and I appreciated the professionalism of it even under the circumstances. Her crest moved once when she reached the contemporaneous commentary section, in a way that I associated by then with something between surprise and recalibration. Not distress. She was too experienced for distress, just recalibration. At the 4-hour mark, she walked back to the main table. The other delegates had mostly stayed in the chamber, sitting in the kind of careful, contained quiet that happens when people are waiting for a decision they cannot influence. Kethsalvar sat down. She looked at the document on the shared terminal for a moment. Then she looked at my desk. "Archivist Salis," she said. It was the first time anyone at the Vethani table had used my name. I had been in the chamber for 10 sessions, and they had referred to me, when they referred to me at all as the observational complement. Yes, I said. This document, she said, includes material from the Vethani delegation's internal communications channel. It does, I said. That channel is understood by diplomatic convention to be confidential. It is understood to be confidential by parties to the convention, I said. I checked the relevant instruments. The confidentiality convention applies to communications between parties who have mutually agreed to the terms. I was not offered the terms. I was not offered a communications protocol agreement of any kind. I was told I was an observational complement. I observed. A long silence. Keth Salvar's tailquills made a small, precise movement that I had come to associate with careful thinking. You understood, she said, that the intent was confidential. I understood that the intent was that I wouldn't be paying close attention, I said. Those are different things. She looked at me for a moment. They are, she said. Another silence, then the discrepancy log. Yes, I said. The original framework agreement. Reference 7741 HT, signed 2/21/70/614, current and not expired, I said. I can give you the exact supersession date for the earlier document it replaced, if that would help. No, she said, I have it. She was quiet again. I waited. I was good at waiting. It is, in some ways, the primary skill of an archivist. The Joint Infrastructure Agreement, she said, the relay stations. Document 4412K, I said, signed 2/20/90307, multi-party, still current. She looked at the table. Yes, she said. I want to be accurate, I said. I'm not suggesting that any of this was necessarily in bad faith. Diplomatic records get complex over long cycles. Documents get misfiled. Delegations work from the records they have. I'm just making sure the record is complete. Keth Salvar looked at me for a moment with an expression that was, I think, the Vethani equivalent of being caught between several things at once and not visibly showing it. That is very generous, she said. It's accurate, I said. There's a difference. Something passed across her expression that I would not have been able to identify in Session 1. By Session 10, I had spent enough time in a room with her to understand that it was the particular quality of attention a very experienced person gives to something that has required them to revise a prior assessment. The treaty, she said, in its current form, would conflict with 3 existing instruments, I said, in ways that would likely not survive a coalition review, depending on how review was triggered. And if it were amended, that would depend on the amendments, I said. I have the original framework agreement and all subsequent instruments in my files. I'd be happy to walk through the relevant provisions. That's an archival function. I can do that. Keth Salvar looked at the table again. Then she looked around the room at the other delegates, at the Gret Holly observers, at the consortium representative, who had stopped looking relaxed some time ago, and was now sitting in the carefully upright posture of someone who has realized they should have been paying closer attention. Then she looked back at my desk. Archivist Solis, she said, this conclave will require an additional session. I thought it might, I said. The existing instruments you mentioned, you have them available. All of them, I said, organized by date and reference number. I can have a structured briefing prepared for the amended drafting session. Comparative analysis of the proposed language against the existing instruments, flagged by section. Standard archival format. How long would that take you to prepare? I've mostly already done it, I said. I've been keeping a running comparative analysis since Session 3. It would need an afternoon to finalize. Keth Salvar was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound not standard Vethani, which my translator rendered as something like of course she has. Tomorrow morning, she said, this chamber, amended drafting session. I'll be here, I said. I'll bring the briefing. And the document, she said, the full document. I have copies, I said. I mentioned that. She looked at me with the expression she had been building toward for the last 4 hours. Not hostile. Not embarrassed, exactly. Something more considered than that. The expression of someone in the process of deciding how to hold new information about the shape of a thing they thought they understood. The observational compliment, she said, was more than observational. The observational compliment was an archivist, I said. I was doing my job. Session 11 ran 12 hours. It was, by my count, the longest single session in the conclave's history for that corridor cycle. I kept the record of that too. The amended drafting took the better part of the morning. I had the briefing prepared, 90 pages, comparative analysis, flagged by section, each discrepancy cross-referenced to the supporting instrument with the exact citation, and a plain language summary of the legal implication. The Vethani legal counsel went through it with the focused precision of people who are very good at their work, and have been handed a document by someone who is also very good at theirs, and are trying to decide if they can find anything wrong with it. They could not find anything wrong with it. I had double-checked it against every instrument in my files. The instruments in my files were complete. By early afternoon, the framework agreement discrepancies had been resolved. The original instrument, 7741 HT, was formally reinstated as the operating basis, with the Vethani proposal reconfigured as an amendment process rather than a replacement. Article 7 survived intact. The usage-weighted priority mechanism was redesigned to apply only to scheduling coordination, not to access rights. The fee schedule was repriced. The sovereignty clause took 3 hours. The relay stations were the hard part. The Vethani legal counsel argued, reasonably, that the administrative classification had created operational ambiguities over the years, and that some clarification of jurisdiction would be useful. I did not dispute this. I tabled the Joint Infrastructure Agreement and the original design specifications for the stations and the maintenance records for the last decade, all of which I had in my files. We went through them. By mid-afternoon, we had a revised sovereignty clause that clarified administrative jurisdiction while preserving joint access rights, consistent with the original infrastructure agreement. The Vethani Council lead, a sharp-featured woman named Keth Varia, who had been working across the table from me for 6 of those 12 hours, set down her stylus at one point and looked at me. "Do you have everything in there?" she said. She meant my files. "I have everything relevant to this conclave," I said. "I prepared the file before I left Earth. I updated it from the conclave archive during the recess periods." She looked at the archival terminal on my desk. "You have been doing this since before you arrived." I knew what the sessions were going to cover, I said. Corridor access, framework revision. I pulled every instrument that could conceivably be relevant. Standard preparation for an archival posting. "For an observational posting," she said. "I didn't know exactly what I'd be observing," I said. She picked up her stylus again. "No," she said, "I imagine not." The treaty was signed at 2147, Station Standard. The final instrument was 8 pages shorter than the version that had been headed for signature the day before, and it bore approximately 60 amendments in the critical sections. The framework agreement was properly cited. Article 7 was intact. The fee schedule was correct. The relay stations were correctly classified. The off-record commentary appendix was formally withdrawn from the public record at Keth Salvar's request, a reasonable request, and one I agreed to, because the purpose of that appendix had never been to embarrass anyone. It had been to establish clearly and ineradicably that the record existed, that the room had been fully documented, that the person at the desk in the back corner had been paying attention. The purpose of the appendix was to ensure it never needed to be used. It had served its purpose. I withdrew it. Before the final signatures, Keth Salvar called a brief recess. She walked from the main table to my desk in the back corner. I don't think, in 10 sessions before that moment, she had walked to my side of the room at all. She stood in front of my desk. Her crest was in a posture I hadn't seen before, lower than the formal display, different from the casual position. Something deliberate in it. "Archivist Solis," she said. "Session chair," I said. "The Human Foreign Service," she said, "sent an archivist." "Yes," I said. "Not a negotiator, not a trade representative, not a legal counsel." "Not formally," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at my terminal, and the folder on the edge of my desk, and the organized stack of reference materials that I had kept neat and accessible across 11 sessions of being the observational complement near the recording equipment. "Was this the intent?" she said. "When they assigned you, was this what they sent you to do?" I thought about Peltz in his gray cardigan with his cold coffee, sliding the transfer papers across the desk. The exact words he had used: "You keep the record, you file your reports, you come home." "I was sent to keep the record," I said. Kethsalvar was quiet for a moment. Her tail quills made a small, careful movement. "We have a phrase," she said, "in the Vethani diplomatic service. Translated precisely, it means, be careful what you dismiss as irrelevant. Irrelevance has opinions." "That's a good phrase," I said. "We do not," she said, "always take our own advice." She went back to the main table. The session resumed. The treaty was signed. Afterward, as the chamber was clearing, Sovath stopped by my desk again. He stood there for a moment, looking at me packing up the archival terminal and the reference materials and the folder with the physical copies, doing the end-of-session tasks I had done at the end of every session. "She's going to cite you," he said, "Kethsalvar, in the session record as a contributing party." I paused in my packing. "I'm the observational complement," I said. "She amended the session record," he said. "She reclassified your designation." I looked at him. "Archivist, active diplomatic function," he said. "Her words." I thought about this for a moment. Then I finished packing my terminal. "How long did you know," Sovath said, "that you had all of it? That you were building the document?" "Session 1, I said. He made the sound his crest had been making in various configurations for 12 hours. This version my translator rendered as something between naturally and yes, of course. "You never said anything," he said, "for 10 sessions. "I didn't need to," I said. "I was keeping the record. That's what you do with a record. You keep it until it's needed. Then you table it." He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the table of contents, still visible on the shared screen at the front of the room. "She wrote things down," he said quietly. "Not to me, more to himself, or possibly to the room in general." "Yes," I said. "We tend to." I took the elevator down to the docking bay, boarded the courier vessel back to the transit hub, and filed my final session report to Peltz at the bureau before the ship had cleared the station's navigation zone. Summary: 11 sessions complete, treaty signed, copy of final instrument attached. Minor procedural complications in sessions 9 and 10, resolved prior to signature. Full archival record in separate transmission. Peltz replied 4 days later. It was a short message. It said, "Thorough as always, Solis, safe travels." I thought about that for a while. Thorough as always. I filed the archival record. I updated my professional log. I flagged the Corridor Access Treaty for the standard 7-year review cycle, and cross-referenced it to the original framework instruments in case anyone needed them in the future. Then I closed my terminal, ate a meal that was hot when I ate it, and looked out the porthole at the corridor where the relay stations caught the light of the Kethavori system star, blinking slowly in the dark the way relay stations do. They had called it a courtesy post. It was not.